Edna Garrison smelled blood before she saw the man in the road. She had been 3 miles out from Alderwood Crossing, following the wagon ruts along the dry bed of what the map called Larkspur Creek, and what was, in truth, nothing more than a ribbon of cracked mud that summer, when her borrowed horse shied hard enough to nearly throw her. She fought the reins, steadied the mare, and saw him then, a man face down in the dust at the edge of the ford, one arm flung out as though he had been reaching for the water that was not there. She was down from the saddle before she had decided to be, her skirts gathered in one fist, her father's old traveling satchel with its ledger and its promissory note still strapped across her shoulder. She knelt beside the stranger and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat the way her mother had taught her, years ago, before the fever took her mother too. No pulse that she could find. His shirt was dark with blood at the shoulder, and there was a raw furrow along his scalp that looked like it had been made by a gun butt rather than a fall. "He is dead," she said aloud, to no one, because there was no one to say it to, and her voice cracked on the words in a way that surprised her. She had traveled 200 miles from the Dalles to collect a debt, not to find a corpse. That was when she heard the horse coming hard down the grade behind her, and turned to see a rider she did not yet know was Clarence Ashford bearing down on her with a rifle across his saddle and murder in his eyes, until he saw it was only a woman kneeling in the road, and hauled his horse up so sharply that it reared and spun. "Get away from him," he said, swinging down before the horse had even settled, and there was iron in his voice, the voice of a man used to being obeyed on a trail where obedience meant survival. "I saw 2 riders coming off my south pasture not 10 minutes back, moving like they had reason to run. I did not touch him beyond feeling for a pulse," Edna said, standing her ground, chin lifted though her heart hammered. "There is none. I am sorry." The man crouched over the stranger, rougher than she had been, turning him half onto his side, and it was then that the dead man was not dead at all. His eyes opened, glassy and wandering, and his hand shot out and closed on Clarence Ashford's wrist with a strength that seemed impossible in a body so broken. "The boxes," the stranger rasped. "Corwin's men took the boxes. Don't let them reach the mill before the count. Whitlock. Tell them Whitlock saw Prute's face. Tell them." His grip loosened. His eyes rolled white and he went slack again, though this time his chest rose and fell, shallow but steady, and Edna realized with a jolt that he had only fainted from the effort of speaking. "He is alive," she said. "Barely. We must get him out of the sun and see to that wound before he bleeds out." Clarence Ashford looked at her then, really looked, as if noticing for the first time that the woman kneeling in the dust of his ranch road wore a traveling dress too fine for a homesteader, and spoke with the flat, careful diction of a schoolteacher. He was younger than she had expected a wagon master to be, sun-browned and rangy, with a scar through one eyebrow and eyes the gray-blue of river stone, and he was already stripping off his own coat to press against the wounded man's shoulder before she had finished her sentence. "You know something about doctoring," he said. It was not quite a question. "I know something about most things a person needs to survive on a frontier," Edna said. "My father ran a mercantile and freight office in the Dalles for 20 years. I have set bones and stitched wounds since I was 12. Then you will do a sight better than I will." He looked past her, down the empty road, then back at the man they had both nearly left for dead. "We cannot leave him here. Whoever did this might come back to finish the job, and I am not inclined to let that happen on my land." Together they lifted the stranger, Edna taking his boots and Clarence his shoulders, and carried him between them the 1/4 mile up the lane to a low ranch house of weathered gray boards, set beneath a stand of fir that had somehow kept its green through a summer that had turned everything else the color of old bone. A dog rose from the porch and paced anxious circles around them as they carried their burden inside and laid him on a narrow bed in the front room. It was only once they had him settled, once Edna had cut away the ruined shirt and begun cleaning the wound at his shoulder with carbolic and water boiled fresh from the well, that she allowed herself to study the man whose house this was, and to remember why she had come. "You are Clarence Ashford," she said. It was not a question either. She had seen his name often enough these past weeks, written in her father's careful hand at the bottom of a promissory note, $400 payable upon demand, dated 11 years past. Something shifted in his face, wary now. "I am. And you would be the daughter, then. Garrison's girl. He wrote me last spring that he might send someone to settle accounts before he passed. I am sorry for your loss, Miss Garrison. Walter Garrison was as fair a man as ever fronted a young fool the money to buy his first string of mules." "Edna," she said. "My name is Edna Garrison, and yes, I have come about the note. $400 with interest accrued these 11 years comes to considerably more, Mr. Ashford, and I will need it, all of it, and soon." He wiped his hands on a rag, and for a moment something like humor moved behind the wariness in his eyes, though the circumstances hardly called for it. "You ride 200 miles to dun a man for an old debt, and the first thing you do upon arriving is save the life of a stranger on his property, free of charge. You are either the most dedicated collector in the territory, Miss Garrison, or the kindest, and I confess I cannot decide which." "I do not see why a person cannot be both," Edna said, tying off the bandage with brisk, competent hands. "Now, this man needs a doctor and rest, and someone to sit with him in case that fever climbs. And you and I need to discuss what he meant about boxes, and a man named Corwin, and someone called Prout, because from where I am kneeling, Mr. Ashford, it sounds a good deal like he was left for dead to keep him from testifying to something." Clarence Ashford looked down at the pale, breathing stranger in his bed, and then out the window toward the dust-brown hills where Larkspur County's first election under statehood was less than 6 weeks away, and where every man in 3 townships had been arguing for a year over who would control what little water remained. "It sounds," he said slowly, "like you have arrived at an interesting time, Miss Garrison." He straightened, and something settled into his shoulders, the look of a man taking up a weight he recognized. "You had best stay for supper. We have a great deal to discuss, and I do not intend to discuss it on an empty stomach, nor to let you ride back to town alone after dark with whoever did this still loose on the road." Edna opened her mouth to say that she had not come to be fed, she had come to be paid, and that supper had nothing to do with either the $400 or the dying stranger bleeding into his bedsheets. But the words did not quite come. There was something in the plain, unhurried decency of the invitation, something that reminded her of her father's kitchen table in the Dalles before the fever took him, and she found herself nodding instead. "Supper, then," she said. "And after supper, Mr. Ashford, we will speak of the note." "After supper," he agreed, and went to put a pot of beans on the stove with the ease of a man who had cooked for himself on 100 trail nights, while outside the light went long and gold over the parched hills, and the wounded man in the front room breathed on, unconscious, holding whatever he knew inside him like a coal banked against the wind. The supper, when it came, was simple: beans and salt pork, biscuits a little heavy but honest, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. They ate at a scarred pine table with the lamp turned low, the wounded stranger's ragged breathing carrying faintly from the front room, and Clarence Ashford told her, between mouthfuls, the whole shape of the trouble that had settled over Alderwood Crossing like the drought itself. Larkspur County was new, carved out that spring from the eastern edge of a larger county when the legislature redrew the lines, and it needed a county seat, a sheriff, a board of commissioners, and most urgently of all, in a year when every creek had shrunk to a trickle and every rancher eyed his neighbor's ditch with suspicion, it needed someone to sit as water master and decide whose claims held priority. Silas Corwin, who owned the ferry crossing on the Larkspur River and the only steam mill for 30 miles, wanted that seat for himself, or failing that, for a man who would do exactly as Corwin told him. "He has been buying up water rights quiet as you please for 2 years, Clarence said, waiting for a dry season to make them worth something. This is the driest anyone can remember. If Corwin's man wins the commissioner's seat, he will control who gets to draw from the river and who does not, and half the small ranchers in this county will be selling out to him by spring, whether they want to or not. And the stranger in your front room, his name is Whitlock, if I heard him right. There was a deputy registrar sent out from the territorial land office to oversee the ballot count, a stranger to these parts, so no one could say he favored one side or the other. If he was carrying ballot boxes from the outlying precincts and Corwin's men took them, Clarence set down his fork. That is not politics anymore, Miss Garrison. That is theft, and worse. Edna folded her hands in her lap, the schoolteacher in her rising instinctively to the shape of the problem. Then the honest thing is to ride for the sheriff tonight and lay the whole matter before him. The sheriff is a decent enough man, but he owes his position to a mortgage Corwin holds on his brother's feed store, and I would not lay heavy odds on which way he would jump if it came to naming Corwin outright. Clarence rubbed a hand over his jaw. I have spent 11 years bringing wagon trains over passes that killed better men than me, Miss Garrison. You learn out there that the honest thing and the effective thing are not always the same thing, and a man who cannot tell them apart gets people killed. And I have spent my life watching men decide that the effective thing excuses them from the honest thing, Edna said, sharper than she meant to. My father extended credit to half the failed farmers between here and the Dalles because it was the honest thing to do, and died believing the world owed better to people who tried. I did not ride 200 miles to watch another good man talk himself into looking away. For a moment the only sound was the wind working at a loose shutter, and the stranger's breath rasping from the next room. Then, unexpectedly, Clarence Ashford smiled, a real smile that crinkled the skin at the corners of his eyes. You have got some bite to you, Miss Garrison. I have got a schoolhouse to build, Mr. Ashford, and $400 of my father's money is going into the lumber for it, whether Silas Corwin approves of educated children or not. I did not come here to look away from anything. A schoolhouse. He said it slowly, as though turning the word over. Alderwood Crossing has needed a schoolteacher for 2 years. The town council put out the call, then withdrew it when half of them got to arguing over where a school ought to sit and who ought to pay the taxes for it. I did not think anyone fool enough to take the position would actually arrive. I am not a fool, Mr. Ashford. I am simply not accustomed to letting other people's cowardice decide what I will and will not attempt. She met his eyes across the lamp light, and something passed between them that was not quite argument and not quite agreement, something closer to respect finding its unexpected footing. Now, about the note. He reached into a tin box on the shelf behind him and drew out a worn leather pouch, counting coin and bills onto the table with the deliberate care of a man who had thought about this moment for a long while. I have $210 here, saved from the last freighting contract and the sale of some stock. It is not the whole of what I owe with interest, but it is honest money, and I will not insult you by offering less than I have. The balance I can pay within the month, once I have sold the timber off my north section, if you will trust me that far. Edna looked at the money on the table, then at the man who had offered it without argument, without the wheedling or the excuses she had half expected from every debtor her father had ever described to her. That is more forthright than I anticipated, Mr. Ashford. My father raised me to pay what I owe, Miss Garrison, and I intend to, in full, debt and interest both, though I confess I am glad to have met the collector before I finished paying, rather than after. There was warmth in it, a careful, testing warmth, like a man setting his weight on ice he was not yet certain would hold. I would count it a kindness if you would take a room at the boarding house in town tonight rather than ride back in the dark, and allow me to see Whitlock safely to Dr. Pierce in the morning. After that, I expect you and I will have more to discuss than debts. Edna gathered the money into her satchel, feeling the schoolhouse take one step closer to reel beneath her fingers, and found she was not entirely thinking about the schoolhouse at all. I expect we will, Mr. Ashford, she said. Good night. Dr. Pierce was a stooped, gray man who had come west in '62 and seen enough gunshot wounds and infected blisters to have opinions about most things. And his opinion, delivered the next morning over Thomas Whitlock's fevered body, was that the man would live if the wound did not turn putrid, and that whoever had struck him had meant to kill him and been interrupted before finishing the job. Edna stood in the doctor's small surgery behind the mercantile, having ridden into Alderwood Crossing at first light with Clarence and the wagon carrying the wounded man, and looked out the window at the town that was to be her home. It was smaller than the Dalles, a single wide street of false-fronted buildings baking under a sky gone white with heat and dust, the Larkspur River running low and brown behind the buildings on the north side, the great slow wheel of Corwin's ferry barge sitting nearly idle at its landing for want of enough water to make the current worth fighting. Timber-topped hills rose behind the town in every direction, dark green turned dusty and dry, and she could smell wood smoke even at this hour, someone's cookfare or perhaps, more worryingly, someone's careless spark in tinder that had not seen rain in 10 weeks. "He will not be fit to speak clearly for days," Dr. Pierce said, straightening from his patient. "Whatever he knows, it will keep or it will not, but you will get nothing coherent from him wringing your hands over his bedside. Then we had best find other ways to learn what happened to those ballot boxes," Edna said. The doctor's eyebrows rose. He glanced at Clarence, who stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and something unspoken passed between the two men, the look of people who had lived a long while in a small place and understood exactly how dangerous a sentence like that could be. "You would do well to be careful who hears you say such things, Miss Garrison," Dr. Pierce said. "This town has more ears than it has honest mouths." That warning proved prophetic before the sun was 2 hours higher. Edna walked from the doctor's surgery to the office of the town council to inquire, as she had planned for weeks, about the lot that had been promised for a schoolhouse, only to find Silas Corwin himself standing on the boardwalk outside, a broad, well-fed man in a good coat despite the heat, flanked by 2 other members of the council who would not quite meet her eyes. "Miss Garrison, I presume," Corwin said, and his voice was pleasant, cultured even, the voice of a man who had learned that courtesy served him better than threats in front of witnesses. "Word travels fast in a small town. I understand you and Ashford found poor Mr. Whitlock on the Larkspur Road yesterday evening." "We did," Edna said evenly, "and I understand he had a great deal to say about the men who left him there." "A man raving with a fever and a cracked skull will say a great many things, most of them nonsense," Corwin said, still pleasant, though something flattened behind his eyes. "It would be a shame if wild talk from a delirious stranger were allowed to poison the reputation of decent men before an election that matters a great deal to the future of this county. I would hate to see a newcomer, however well-meaning, get herself entangled in matters better left to men who understand the situation." "I understand a great many situations, Mr. Corwin," Edna said. "I understand a man does not get beaten near to death and left in a dry creek bed over nothing at all. I have come about the schoolhouse lot the council promised 18 months ago. I would be obliged if we could discuss that and leave Mr. Whitlock's condition to the doctor." Something in Corwin's smile thinned further, and one of the councilmen beside him, a narrow, nervous man named Beecher, cleared his throat. "About the lot, Miss Garrison. There has been some question raised as to whether the town can spare the tax money for a schoolhouse this year, given the drought and the difficulties with the water claims. Perhaps it would be wiser to wait until after the election, when matters have settled." "Children do not stop needing to learn their letters because the creek ran low, Mr. Beecher," Edna said. "I have brought my own funds for lumber. I ask only for the lot that was promised, and I will build the rest myself if I must." Corwin studied her for a long moment, the pleasantness in his face never quite slipping, though Edna had the distinct sense of being weighed and priced, the way a man might weigh a length of rope he was deciding whether to buy or to use against someone. We will take the matter under advisement, Miss Garrison. Good day." He touched his hat and moved off down the boardwalk, the councilmen trailing him like well-trained dogs, and Edna stood alone in the dust and the heat, her jaw set, understanding with perfect clarity that she had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in Larkspur County on her second day in town. Clarence found her there a few minutes later, having settled his horses at the livery, and read the whole of the encounter from her face before she said a word of it. "He threatened you," he said. "It was not a question." "He was perfectly polite," Edna said, "which was, if anything, worse. He as good as told me to keep quiet about Mr. Whitlock, and then took my schoolhouse lot hostage to make certain I understood the price of not obeying." Clarence's jaw tightened, and for a moment the easy warmth of the previous night's supper was gone, replaced by something harder, more watchful, the look of a man calculating distances and dangers the way he must have once calculated the safe fording depth of a river with a wagon train waiting behind him. "Then we had better be smarter than he expects us to be, Miss Garrison, because I do not believe for one moment that a polite word from Silas Corwin is the whole of what he intends." He was right, though it would be 3 more days before either of them understood how right, and by then the trouble had already begun to close around them both like water rising behind a dam that everyone in Larkspur County had been too afraid to admit was cracking. In those 3 days, something else began as well, quieter and more welcome than the trouble, though neither of them named it yet. Clarence rode into town each morning on the pretext of checking on Whitlock, and stayed each time a little longer than the errand required. And on the second evening he arrived at the boarding house with a wagon and a stack of rough-cut lumber from his own north section, unasked, and set it beside the empty lot the council had grudgingly confirmed she could use, water or no water, tax money or no tax money. "You did not have to do this," Edna said, standing in the lengthening evening light as he unloaded boards with the easy strength of a man who had spent a lifetime lifting things heavier than himself. "No," he agreed. "But you paid me the courtesy of trusting a stranger's word about a debt 11 years old, Miss Garrison, and I find I would like to be the sort of man who returns a courtesy like that." He set down the last board and straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. "Besides, I have spent 11 years leading families across mountains and rivers to build something new on the far side. It does not sit easy with me to watch a woman try to build a schoolhouse alone against a man like Corwin, when I have got 2 good hands and a wagon doing nothing more useful than sitting in my barn." "You make it sound as though a schoolhouse and a mountain pass are the same sort of crossing," Edna said, and there was a smile in it despite herself. "They are not so different as you would think," Clarence said. "Both of them are about getting people somewhere safer than where they started, and both of them are a good deal more dangerous than folks expect until they are halfway across." He looked at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then busied himself with the wagon traces to hide it. "I will bring more lumber Thursday if that suits." "That suits very well, Mr. Ashford," Edna said, and found that she was already looking forward to Thursday more than was entirely wise for a woman who had come to town on business and nothing more. It was on the 4th day that the ground began to shift beneath her. She had gone to the mercantile to purchase slates and chalk for the children she hoped would soon fill her half-built schoolhouse, and found the proprietor's wife, a stout, kindly-seeming woman named Mrs. Odell, who had greeted her warmly enough on her arrival, now cool and evasive, refusing to quite meet her eye. "I heard," Mrs. Odell said, folding a bolt of cloth with unnecessary vigor, "that you have been telling folks Mr. Corwin's men tried to murder that registrar on the Larkspur Road. That is a serious thing to be saying, Miss Garrison, about a man who has done more for this town than anyone living." "I have said only what Mr. Whitlock himself said, while conscious, before he collapsed," Edna answered, keeping her voice level with an effort. "I have accused no one of anything. I have simply refused to pretend I heard nothing." "Some folks are saying," Mrs. Odell went on, not quite listening, that you cooked the whole story up with that Ashford man to make trouble, on account of you wanting his money and needing an excuse to stir up sympathy for yourself and your schoolhouse. Some folks are saying a woman traveling around unescorted collecting debts from bachelor ranchers is not the sort of person this town ought to trust with its children in the first place. The words landed like a slap, and Edna felt the blood rise hot in her face, though she kept her hands still and her voice quiet, because she had learned long ago from her father that a raised voice only confirmed a slander in the ears of people already inclined to believe it. "That is a cruel and unfounded thing to say, Mrs. Odell, and I am sorry that someone has convinced you of it." She left the mercantile without her slates, and by the time she reached the boarding house, she understood that the cool looks and lowered voices trailing her down the street were not her imagination. Word, or rather a carefully poisoned version of word, had run ahead of her through Alderwood Crossing like a grass fire through dry stubble, and Silas Corwin, whatever his other qualities, understood exactly how to strike a match. That evening, sitting on the boarding house porch as the heat finally began to break with the coming of dusk, she found herself, for the first time since her father's funeral, close to tears, and hated herself a little for it. Clarence found her there. He had come, as he had most evenings that week, on some pretext of lumber or news of Whitlock's slow recovery, and he read her face in the lamplight from the parlor window and sat down beside her on the porch step without asking permission, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, careful enough to leave a respectable hand's width of space between them. "They are saying I invented the whole thing," Edna said, before he could ask. "That I conspired with you to slander Mr. Corwin because I want your money and a reason to make myself important. Mrs. Odell all but told me to my face that no decent town would trust its children to a woman who travels alone collecting debts from bachelors. That is a lie, and an ugly one, and I am sorry you have had to hear it," Clarence said, and there was real anger in his voice, banked low but unmistakable. "I will speak to every man and woman on that council myself if I have to." "That is precisely what will make it worse," Edna said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, angry now at her own tears more than at Mrs. Odell. "If you defend me too loudly, they will say it only proves the conspiracy, that the wagon master and the schoolteacher are in this together against poor persecuted Mr. Corwin. I have seen this before, Mr. Ashford, in a smaller way in the Dalles, when I first tried to open a school for the freight workers' children and half the town decided I was after their husbands' wages instead of their sons' educations. The only thing that answers a lie like this is time and proof, and refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching you run. You have done this before, then, fought a whole town's opinion at once." "I have done a smaller version of it before," Edna admitted, "and I did not always win. My school in the Dalles closed within the year, when the rumors finally cost me enough students that the council decided it was not worth the trouble of defending me." She looked out at the darkening street, the lamps coming up one by one in windows that had, 4 days ago, seemed friendly enough. "I do not intend to let that happen again, but I will admit, Mr. Ashford, that it is a lonelier fight than I remembered, doing it in a place where I know almost no one." "You are not doing it alone," Clarence said, quiet and certain, and this time he did close the distance between them, just enough that his hand found hers on the porch step and rested there, warm and rough with rope calluses and reins. "Whatever else that man Corwin has bought in this town, he has not bought me, and he will not buy my silence either, whatever he tries to offer." Neither of them moved their hands away for a long moment, and something settled between them on that dark porch that was not quite spoken and did not need to be, a kind of understanding that whatever came next, they would meet it side by side. It was 2 days later that Corwin made his offer plain. He came to Clarence's ranch himself, riding a fine bay gelding with silver on the bridle, and sat his horse in the yard rather than dismounting, the posture of a man who did not intend to stay long enough to be offered coffee. "Ashford," he said, by way of greeting. I understand you have been keeping company with the schoolteacher a good deal these past days, helping her build her little schoolhouse, escorting her about town. Folks are beginning to talk. Folks are always talking, Corwin. I have found it does not much matter what about. It might matter to you, Corwin said, when I tell you that I have decided to forgive the balance of the note Miss Garrison is so determined to collect. $400 and interest is a considerable sum for a man just getting his feet under him. I could arrange to have that debt purchased and canceled outright, Ashford quietly, so no one need ever trouble you for it again. All I would ask in return is that you make it known around town that you no longer credit the wild story Miss Garrison has been telling about my men and that registrar. Clarence stood very still, and Edna, who had come out onto the porch at the sound of the horse and stopped short at the sight of Corwin in the yard, watched him weigh the offer with the same careful, unhurried calculation she had seen him use on a stubborn mule or a doubtful river crossing. "That is a generous offer, Corwin," Clarence said finally. $400 is a great deal of money to a man who has spent his whole life earning it $1 at a time behind a team of mules. I expect there are men in this county who would take it without blinking. But you are not one of them, Corwin said, and it was not quite a question, his easy pleasantness beginning at last to fray at the edges. I made a promise to Walter Garrison 11 years ago that I would pay back every cent he lent me, and I intend to keep that promise to his daughter, whether it costs me $400 or $4,000. And I have not told a single lie about you, Corwin, because I have not needed to. I only told the truth about what I saw and what that man Whitlock said before he passed out in my front room, and I will go on telling it, whatever it costs me, because unlike you, I do not measure a man's worth by what it is convenient for him to say. Clarence's voice had not risen, but something in it had gone flat and hard as river stone. You had best get off my land, Corwin, before I lose the patience to be civil about asking twice. Corwin's face went through several expressions in quick succession and settled at last on something cold and ugly beneath the practiced pleasantness. You will regret this, Ashford. Both of you will. This county is smaller than you think, and I have a longer reach in it than either of you understands. He wheeled his horse and rode off without another word, and Clarence stood watching him go, his hands loose at his sides, though Edna, coming down off the porch to stand beside him, could see they were not entirely steady. That was not wise, she said softly, refusing him so plainly. No, Clarence agreed. It was honest, though, and I have found that the two things do not always sit in the same saddle. He looked at her, something rueful in his smile despite the tension still in his shoulders. I believe, Miss Garrison, that you may be a bad influence on my sense of self-preservation. I believe, Mr. Ashford, Edna said, that you did not need much help in that direction to begin with. But she was smiling too, despite the fear coiling cold in her stomach, because she understood exactly what he had just given up, and exactly why, and it warmed something in her that had gone cold and lonely a long while ago. The weeks that followed were a strange, taut mixture of danger and quiet domestic grace, the two threads winding so closely together that Edna could no longer say where the schoolhouse ended and the courtship began. Clarence came each day now, not merely with lumber but with his own two hands set to the work, and slowly, despite Corwin's whispers, despite the cool looks that still followed Edna down the main street, a schoolhouse began to rise on the lot at the edge of town. 4 walls, a real glass window salvaged from a freight wreck, a chimney Clarence built himself from river stone he hauled up from the dry bed of the Larkspur, working stones that would once have been underwater into a hearth that would keep children warm come winter. Dr. Pierce reported that Thomas Whitlock's fever had broken, and his wound was healing clean, though the blow to his head had left him confused about the exact sequence of events on the night he was attacked, unable yet to give a clear account that would stand up before a judge or a territorial marshal. It was frustrating, dangerous evidence hanging just out of reach, and Edna felt the weeks ticking away toward the election with a mounting, helpless urgency. It was on one such evening, riding back from the schoolhouse sight along the low bluff above the Larkspur River as the light went gold and long, that Clarence first told her about his brother. "I lost him on a crossing," he said without preamble as their horses walked side by side along the dusty track, the drought-shrunk river glinting brown and sluggish below. 9 years back on the Nakas Pass Road, bringing a party of families over before the snow closed the trail. Daniel was 17, wanted to prove himself as capable as me, insisted on driving the lead wagon through a ford I had told him to walk the team through slow. He hurried it. The wagon overturned. He drowned before any of us could reach him, not 30 feet from where I stood. "Clarence," Edna said softly, using his given name for the first time without quite meaning to, "I am so sorry." "I have led 11 wagon trains west since that day, Edna, and I have never once lost another soul on my watch, because I learned to be slow and careful, and to trust nothing to hurry, not even when hurrying seemed the braver choice." He looked at her, something raw and honest in his face that she had not yet seen from him. "This spring I brought the last party over, 6 families bound for claims past the Cascade foothills, and when I saw them settled, I decided I had paid whatever debt I owed my brother's memory, and that it was time to build something of my own instead of always building it for other people, and then riding away. I bought this ranch. I meant to live a quiet life, Edna, tend my cattle, mind my own business, and let the rest of the world go by without me in it. And now a woman rode onto my land collecting an old debt and found a dying man in my road, and refused to look away from either one, and I find that my quiet life has become considerably less quiet, and I cannot say I am sorry for it." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, careful and sure, the reins looped loose over his other wrist. "I am not accustomed to wanting things for myself, Edna Garrison. I have spent so long minding other people's crossings that I nearly forgot how to want one of my own. But I want this one. I want to see your schoolhouse finished, and I want to see Corwin answer for what he has done, and I confess I would like very much to see what comes after that with you if you would allow it." Edna's heart was beating very fast, and she did not pull her hand away. "I came here for $400, Mr. Ashford, and I have paid you 210 of it," he said, "with the rest still owing. I do not suppose that is what you meant, though." "No," she admitted, laughing despite herself, despite the fear and the exhaustion of the past weeks. "It is not what I meant at all." They rode on in a silence that was not uncomfortable, hands still loosely joined, and if either of them noticed the rider watching them from the tree line above the river bluff, neither spoke of it that evening, though the watcher noted well enough what he saw and rode hard for Corwin's mill to report it. The blow, when it came, was worse than either of them had feared. Edna arrived at the schoolhouse site 3 mornings later to find the frame she and Clarence had labored over for 2 weeks scattered and broken. The new-cut lumber splintered and half of it hauled away entirely. The stone hearth Clarence had built with such care kicked apart, stone by stone, and scrawled across the one standing wall in soot and tar, black letters crude but unmistakable: "No school for a liar's brat." She stood in the wreckage for a long time, too shocked even to cry, and it was Clarence who found her there an hour later, and whose face went the color of old ash when he saw what had been done. "This is Corwin's doing," he said, low and furious, "or Prute's working for him. This has gone beyond talk now." "There is no proof," Edna said, though her voice shook. "There will never be proof, Clarence. That is how men like Corwin work. He will make certain his hands stay clean while everything around him burns." It was not only the schoolhouse. That same week, the town council, under pressure Edna could trace directly back to Corwin's parlor, voted to revoke the schoolhouse lot altogether, citing the unrest her presence had caused and the town's need for unity ahead of the election. Mrs. Odell stopped speaking to her entirely. 2 families who had promised to send their children in the fall sent word instead that they had reconsidered. Sheriff Boyd Tanner, when Edna went to him directly to report the vandalism, took down her statement with visible reluctance and promised an investigation that both of them understood would go nowhere. "They are trying to break you," Clarence said that evening, sitting once more on the boarding house porch, though this time there was no comfort in the words, only grim recognition. "Not with violence outright, not yet, but by making this town too small and too frightened to hold you." "They may succeed," Edna said, and hated the despair she heard in her own voice. "I have seen it before, Clarence. A town does not need proof to convict someone. It only needs enough people willing to look away." "Then we will find proof," Clarence said. "Real proof, the kind even a frightened town cannot look away from. Whitlock is strong enough now to be moved, and strong enough, Pierce tells me, to remember more each day. And there is still the matter of those ballot boxes. Boxes that size do not simply vanish, Edna. They are somewhere, and I intend to find them before this county votes." It was a slim hope, and both of them knew it, but it was the only hope they had. And in the days that followed they pursued it with a quiet, careful desperation, riding out separately and together to the outlying precincts, asking careful questions of ranchers and homesteaders who had watched the registrar pass through on his rounds, piecing together, fragment by fragment, the route Thomas Whitlock must have taken on the night he was attacked. And the place along that route where a man might hide 4 heavy strongboxes without drawing notice. It was Edna, in the end, who found the thread that mattered, though it came from an unlikely source. Sitting with Thomas Whitlock during one of Clarence's absences, holding a damp cloth to the man's brow as his fever came and went in slow, waning waves, she heard him murmur, half dreaming, half waking, a single clear phrase amid the fog of his confusion. "The flume," he said. "They put them in the old flume, above the mill. Told me they would burn if I did not sign the false count." Edna sat very still, her heart hammering, and when Dr. Pierce came in a moment later to check his patient, she caught his hand before he could speak and pressed a finger to her lips, and they both listened as Whitlock, still lost in fever, repeated it once more, weaker this time before sinking back into deeper sleep. "The old flume," she said to Clarence that evening, breathless with the discovery. "Above Corwin's mill. That is where the ballot boxes are hidden, Clarence. He means to burn them, or has already, unless we can reach them first." Clarence's face, in the lamplight, went taut with calculation, the look of a man plotting a dangerous crossing. "The flume above the mill has not carried water in 6 weeks, not with the river this low. It would make a fine hiding place, dry and out of the way, until Corwin was ready to be rid of the evidence for good. If he means to destroy those boxes before the count, he will not wait long. The election is 11 days off." "Then we have 11 days to prove what he has done," Edna said, "or watch him steal this county in front of the whole territory." Neither of them could have guessed how little time they would actually be given, nor in what form the reckoning would finally arrive. It came 4 days later, on a morning that began, deceptively, like any other. Clarence had arranged, quietly, to move a load of salvage lumber and stone up toward the old flume road under cover of a legitimate freight run, hoping to scout the hidden ballot boxes without drawing Corwin's notice, and Edna had ridden out with him at first light, unwilling to be left behind at the boarding house while the true fight was decided elsewhere. They had reached the base of the long grade above the mill, where the old flume track ran steep and switchback down toward the mill pond and the cluster of buildings and workers' cabins below, when they heard it, a grinding, groaning shriek of overstressed wood and iron, and then the unmistakable, gathering thunder of a heavy wagon breaking loose and beginning to run. "Get back!" Clarence shouted, already turning his horse, and Edna saw it then, cresting the grade above them. A great timber wagon, fully loaded with cut logs bound for Corwin's mill, its brake beam shattered, its team screaming and half tangled in their traces as the whole rig gathered speed down the steep grade, aimed directly at the cluster of buildings below where, Edna realized with a cold plunge of horror, The mill workers' families had gathered that very morning for a school meeting Corwin himself had grudgingly permitted. A last chance for Edna to plead her case before the whole matter was decided by vote. There were children down there. She could see them now, small figures spilling out of the meeting hall at the sound of the wagon's approach, confused, not yet understanding the danger bearing down on them. "Clarence, I see it." His voice had gone flat and utterly focused, the voice, she understood in that instant, of the wagon master who had crossed a continent's worth of dangerous grades and never lost another soul since the day his brother drowned. "Edna, ride down and get those people clear of the flat ground by the mill pond now. Do not wait for me. I am going after the wagon. You cannot stop that alone." "I do not intend to stop it," he said, already spurring his horse up the slope alongside the runaway team, angling to come alongside the panicked lead horses rather than in front of them. "I intend to turn it." Edna did not waste breath arguing. She wheeled her mare and drove her down the grade at a reckless gallop, skirts and hair streaming, shouting at the top of her voice for the people below to clear the flat ground to get back, to run for the high side of the millpond road. Faces turned up toward her, confusion breaking into panic as they heard the wagon's thunder rolling down behind her, and she saw Mrs. Odell, of all people, snatch up two small children by the arms and haul them bodily toward the safety of the rocks above the pond, and other hands reaching, other voices taking up the cry, the whole small crowd scattering and surging toward higher ground in the space of a few desperate heartbeats. Above them, Clarence had drawn nearly level with the lead horses, leaning far out of his saddle at a speed that made Edna's stomach clench with terror, his hand closing on the cheek strap of the near horse's bridle. He hauled with all his strength, fighting the panicked animal's own momentum, trying to bend the whole runaway team toward the wider curve of the road where it looped away from the mill buildings, and out toward the open, rocky flat above the riverbed, empty ground where a wreck would break wood and bone perhaps, but not lives. For one terrible instant it seemed the team would drag him from the saddle entirely, his horse stumbling, nearly going down beneath him, and Edna's heart stopped in her chest. Then the lead horse's head came around, fighting its own herd mates, and the whole tangled, shrieking mass of horses and wagon began, agonizingly slow, to bend its course away from the buildings and toward the open flat. It was not enough on its own. The wagon, heavy with its load of logs, did not turn so easily as the horses, and Edna saw with sick clarity that the great rig was going to jackknife, its rear wheels sliding wide on the loose gravel, aimed now not at the mill but at the narrow bridge across the mill pond spillway, where three men stood frozen, too slow to clear the span in time. She did not think. She drove her mare straight into the path of the skidding wagon's swing, close enough that she could feel the heat of the terrified team's breath, and screamed and waved her arms and the coat she had torn from her own shoulders, a wild, desperate flag of motion that startled the wheel horses into a last, convulsive swerve away from the bridge and into the soft sand of the empty riverbed beyond, where the wagon finally shuddered, tipped, and came apart in a great splintering crash of logs and broken timber. 20 feet short of the three frozen men, who scrambled the last distance to safety on legs gone weak with terror. The dust took a long moment to settle. When it did, Edna slid from her trembling horse to find Clarence already there, unhorsed himself in the final chaos, limping but upright, hauling the exhausted, wild-eyed team clear of the wreckage with hands that would not quite stop shaking. He turned and saw her, and something broke open in his face, relief so raw it looked almost like pain. "You are not hurt," he said, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "No," she said, and found her own voice unsteady. "Are you?" "Only bruised, I think." He reached out and cupped her face in both hands, dust-streaked and trembling, and looked at her for a long moment as though he could not quite believe she was whole and standing in front of him. "You rode straight at a runaway wagon, Edna Garrison. You climbed onto a runaway team at a full gallop, Clarence Ashford. I do not believe either of us is in a position to lecture the other on foolish courage." He laughed, a short, startled sound, half relief and half disbelief. And then he kissed her, there in the settling dust with the wreckage smoking gently behind them and half the town's mill workers watching with their hearts still in their throats. Kissed her hard and desperate and grateful, and she kissed him back with everything the last terrible minute had wrung out of her. Both of them shaking, both of them alive, both of them finally, entirely certain of something neither had dared to name outright until now. When at last they broke apart, breathless, Edna pressed her forehead to his chest and felt his heart hammering as hard as her own. "I do not know what this means," she said, half laughing, half frightened by the largeness of the feeling in her chest. "I came here to collect a debt, Clarence. I did not come here to fall in love with the man who owed it." "I did not intend to fall in love with the woman collecting it either," he admitted, one hand still resting warm against her cheek. "But I find I am not sorry for it, whatever comes next, election or no election, Corwin or no Corwin." "There is still Corwin," she reminded him gently, reluctantly, as reality began to reassert itself around the wreckage and the murmuring crowd of witnesses. "There is still Corwin," Clarence agreed, and something in his eyes hardened again, the fear and the tenderness both giving way to grim resolve. "But I do not believe, Edna, that this wagon broke its brake beam by accident, not this morning of all mornings, not on this grade. I believe someone meant for that wagon to run, and I do not believe they much cared who stood in its way." It did not take long to prove him right. Among the shattered timbers of the wrecked wagon, wedged beneath the broken logs where it had evidently been hidden for transport, one of the mill workers found a strong box, its lock forced, its lid sprung in the crash, spilling out a scatter of sealed ballot envelopes and 2 heavy tin boxes stamped with the seal of the territorial election office. Word ran through the gathered crowd like the fire everyone had feared all summer, and by the time Sheriff Tanner arrived, summoned at a dead run by one of the mill boys, there was no possibility of quietly making the discovery disappear, not with 40 witnesses standing in the wreckage and Edna Garrison already reading the seals aloud in a clear, carrying voice that left no doubt as to what had been found. "These are the missing precinct boxes," she said. "From Deer Creek and Miller's Flat, sealed the night before Mr. Whitlock was attacked on the Larkspur Road. Someone hid them in a wagon bound for Mr. Corwin's own mill, and that same wagon's brake failed this morning in a manner that very nearly killed 3 of his own workers along with half the children of this town." Sheriff Tanner, to his credit, went pale and grim rather than evasive, perhaps finally understanding that a mortgage on his brother's feed store was a poor trade against being seen to cover up an attempted murder of children in broad daylight before 40 witnesses. "I will need to take those boxes into custody, and I will need a full account from everyone here," he said, and something in his voice suggested that whatever debt of loyalty he had owed Silas Corwin, it had just come due in a currency he was no longer willing to pay. It took 3 more days to unravel the whole of it, days in which Thomas Whitlock, growing stronger daily and finally lucid enough to give a clear account, identified Jake Pruitt by name and description as the man who had struck him on the Larkspur Road and threatened to burn him alive in his own wagon if he did not certify a false count favoring Corwin's chosen candidate. Pruitt, faced with the physical evidence of the recovered boxes and a signed statement from a mill hand who had seen him loading the strongbox onto the timber wagon under cover of darkness, broke within a single night in the county jail and gave a full confession implicating Silas Corwin directly in the theft of the ballots, the attack on Whitlock, and though he claimed the sabotaged brake beam had been meant only to frighten Whitlock's replacement rather than kill anyone. An admission that Corwin had ordered the wagon sent down that grade knowing full well who stood at the bottom of it. Silas Corwin did not wait to be arrested. He was gone from Alderwood Crossing within a day of Pruitt's confession, his fine bay gelding and a hastily packed saddlebag the only trace of him, riding, most folks assumed, for the territorial line and whatever life a man could build for himself where his name did not yet carry the stink of theft and attempted murder. The county commissioner's election held 11 days later than originally planned to allow the recovered ballots to be properly recounted, under the direct supervision of a territorial marshal sent for the purpose, went decisively to Nathaniel Cobb, a rancher from the Miller's Flat precinct whose only real qualification, as far as Edna could tell, was that he had never once tried to steal a single vote in his life, and who promised, credibly, to see the county's water claims divided fairly among small ranchers and large alike, drought or no drought. The town, having spent weeks believing the worst of Edna Garrison, now swung with equal fervor in the opposite direction. Mrs. Odell appeared at the boarding house 3 days after Corwin's flight with a basket of preserves, and an apology so thorough and so mortified that Edna found she could not hold onto her anger, however justified it might have been. The town council, in a meeting Edna attended with Clarence's steady presence at her shoulder, voted unanimously not only to restore the schoolhouse lot, but to fund the rebuilding of the structure Corwin's men had destroyed, and Nathaniel Cobb himself, newly elected and eager to distance the county's reputation from his predecessor's shadow, personally pledged county lumber and labor toward finishing the work before the first snow. It was, Edna thought, watching the new frame of the schoolhouse rise faster and sturdier than the first attempt, a strange kind of justice, imperfect and late, and one at a cost that had nearly killed several people she had come to care for deeply, but justice nonetheless, the kind her father had always insisted was worth fighting for even when the fight seemed hopeless. There remained, of course, the matter of the debt. Clarence came to her on a cool evening in late September, the first real relief the drought had offered all year finally breaking in a slow, soaking rain that drummed on the boarding house roof and filled the dry gutters of Alderwood Crossing with the sound of running water for the first time in months, and found her on the porch watching the rain with an expression of such quiet contentment that he nearly did not want to disturb it. "I have sold the timber off the north section," he said, holding out a small leather pouch heavier than the first had been. $190, which with what I already paid, settles the note in full, principal and interest both, exactly as your father's ledger records it. Edna took the pouch, weighed it in her hand and looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You did not have to sell the timber, Clarence. We could have found another arrangement. I gave you my word 11 years before I ever met you, through your father, that I would pay this debt in full," Clarence said. "I do not intend to let falling in love with the collector be my excuse for breaking that word. Some debts ought to be paid clean, Edna, so that whatever comes after between us begins on honest ground and not on an account still owing. That is," Edna said slowly, "a remarkably principled position for a man who once told me the honest thing and the effective thing are not always the same." "I have had a persuasive teacher these past months," Clarence said, and the smile that came with it undid her entirely. "Will you take the payment, Miss Garrison, and consider the matter of Walter Garrison's note fully and finally closed between us?" "I will," she said, closing her hand around the pouch, and then before either of them could think better of it, closing the distance between them as well, rain misting cool against her face, and kissed him there on the porch in full view of anyone who cared to look, no longer caring in the least what the town might say of it, because the town, this time, had nothing but well-wishing to offer. "The debt is paid," she said, when at last they drew apart, both of them laughing a little at their own boldness. "But I find, Clarence Ashford, that I am not nearly ready to be done collecting from you. What else could you possibly want from me, Edna Garrison, now that the note is settled?" "Supper," she said, echoing his own words back to him from that first strange, dangerous evening. "Every evening for the rest of my life if you are offering. And perhaps, in time, a wedding ring to go with it, though I am willing to negotiate the terms." Clarence Ashford, veteran of 11 wagon crossings and 100 dangerous fords, who had faced down runaway teams and armed threats without so much as a tremor in his hands, found himself entirely undone by that quiet, laughing offer, and answered it in the only way that seemed adequate, which was to kiss her again, longer this time, while the rain fell soft and steady around them and the whole dry summer finally, gratefully, gave way to autumn. They were married the second Sunday of October, in the half-finished but entirely sound schoolhouse that had, by then, become as much a symbol of the town's redemption as of Edna's own stubborn dedication, its new glass window catching the pale gold light of a morning finally cool and clean after weeks of steady rain. Nearly the whole of Alderwood Crossing turned out for it, crowding onto the raw plank benches that would, come Monday, hold a first class of 11 children ranging from 6 years old to 14. Mrs. Odell had baked 3 separate cakes as though determined to apologize for her earlier coldness through sheer volume of butter and sugar, and Dr. Pierce gave the bride away in the absence of her own father, walking her down the short aisle between the benches with a gruff formality that could not quite hide how moved he was. Thomas Whitlock, fully recovered and returned briefly from the territorial capital, where he had gone to give testimony in Silas Corwin's absentia trial, stood near the back with his hat over his heart, and Nathaniel Cobb, the new county commissioner, offered a short, sincere speech about honest debts and honest people that made half the room reach for handkerchiefs. Clarence stood at the front of the schoolhouse in a coat Edna had never seen before, clearly new-bought for the occasion, his hair combed flat and already beginning to rebel against the effort, watching her come toward him down the aisle with an expression of such open, undefended tenderness that she felt her own eyes sting with tears before she had even reached him. "I never thought," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear, as the traveling preacher who had ridden 3 days from the nearest circuit to perform the ceremony cleared his throat to begin, "that a woman come to collect a debt would end up collecting the whole of my heart along with it." "I never thought," Edna murmured back, "that I would ride 200 miles for $400 and come home with considerably more than I bargained for." The preacher spoke the old, familiar words, and outside the new-built walls the autumn wind carried the smell of rain-soaked earth and wood smoke and the far green scent of the timbered hills. And when Clarence Ashford and Edna Garrison were pronounced husband and wife, the whole small, crowded schoolhouse rose in a single motion, cheering, and somewhere near the back Mrs. Odell burst into tears over her 3 cakes, and it seemed to Edna, standing on her toes to kiss her new husband in front of the whole town that had once turned against her and now could not seem to celebrate her enough, that every hard mile of the journey that had brought her here, every debt and every danger, every cold look and every dangerous crossing, had led with a kind of inevitable grace to exactly this moment, in exactly this place, beside exactly this man. They held the wedding supper on trestle tables set up outside the schoolhouse in the last warm light of the afternoon, the whole town contributing what it could, roasted meat and fresh bread, and the last of the season's vegetables from gardens that had struggled all summer against the drought, and finally, with the autumn rains, begun to recover. Clarence sat beside his new wife with her hand held loosely in his beneath the table, and when Nathaniel Cobb rose to offer a final toast, he lifted his cup along with everyone else and found that he could not remember, in 11 years of trail dust and lonely campfires and careful, guarded solitude, ever once having felt so entirely, unreservedly at home. "To Edna and Clarence Ashford," Cobb said, his voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd in the cooling evening air, "who came to this town in the middle of its hardest season and left it a good deal more honest and a good deal better watered than they found it." The crowd laughed and cheered and drank, and somewhere in the hills above the schoolhouse, the first true rain clouds of autumn were gathering dark and welcome against the last light of the sky, promising the kind of steady, soaking rain that would fill the Larkspur River back to its banks and end, at last, the long, dry summer that had brought them all so much trouble and, in its own strange way, had brought Edna Garrison and Clarence Ashford together as well. Edna leaned her head against her husband's shoulder as the last light faded and the first stars came out over Alderwood Crossing, and thought that whatever debts remained to be paid in this life, she had never once regretted the $400 that had brought her here, nor the supper that had made her stay long enough to fall in love. "Are you happy, Edna Garrison Ashford?" Clarence asked softly, testing the shape of her new name. "I am," she said, and meant it entirely. "I came here to collect a debt, Clarence. I never imagined I would end up rich." He laughed, low and warm, and pressed a kiss to her hair. And around them the town they had both, in their own separate and now joined ways, helped to save settled into the first peaceful evening it had known in a very long while the rain began, gently, to fall.